June 15, 2012. They haven't come yet, but I know they will. For days now I've anxiously awaited their arrival, each day just as today, arising early and making myself a cup of coffee and patiently listening. As I slowly sip the warm, dark but sweetened liquid, my mind wanders away from where I am, just aimlessly drifting through the now fading memories of a life that once was. The quiet of these early morning hours is comforting, and I find my strength in these stolen moments of time before the world around me comes to life and my momentary solitude is invaded by the chaos that this world is. As I stand to stretch my eyes, catch that plastic mirror that now hangs from the narrow steel beam that separates the wall of bars from the door of my cage. It's familiar sight, as countless times have I looked within myself through that simple reflection, and through that reflection confronted my inner self and the truths that only too often are only too elusive. The man in the mirror is not a stranger, and yet I continue to discover new unpeeled layers of that familiar reflection, and the man I am within. But at this moment, it's not about the mirror, but what hangs just beneath that mirror that causes me to pause and reflect. It is a message, perhaps even a mantra, that I long ago wrote to myself, and although I have read it countless times, each time those few words put my world into perspective. I've been through the dark side of hell and back again. I've journeyed through life with nary a friend. I've laughed and I've cried. I've lived and I've died. And each day I am condemned to do it again and again. It has now been over 2 decades since I wrote those words to myself, not long after coming within hours of my own execution. The words came so easily, as if inspired by something greater within me. I doubt many could truly understand what those words mean. But I didn't write them for anyone but myself, and I know what they mean. And to me those words are a source of strength, not despair. Through the many years, friends have come and gone, and although I am truly blessed by a handful of friends who have faithfully stood by my side even during the darkest days, at the end of each day, I still go to sleep alone, and at the beginning of every new day, I still wake alone. In the endless hours between, I remain in my solitaire cage, alone. When I laugh alone, and when I cry alone. If this life I live could be called living, then I live alone, and when my final hour comes, I know I will die alone. To say that I have journeyed through life with nary a friend is not to say that I have never been blessed by friendship, but only that at the end of the day they live in their world and I live in mine. No matter how much we both might try to meet in the middle and find that common ground we can walk together, it is like an eagle soaring in the skies above, looking down and longing to swim with the fish below. We are of 2 different worlds. Inevitably the friends drift away. Even the very best of friends, as that's just how it is when the months pass on to years and the years pass on to decades. I've come to accept that and choose to enjoy the time we can share together. My fate is not their fault, and I am truly blessed by those who can reach out as they become a source of strength, even if only in passing. I now smile when each will ask that same question. Those of the real world will always ask of those of us in this world, how do you survive and even stay sane after so many, many years in solitary confinement, condemned to death? Some will go a step further and express their admiration for my strength and perseverance. But if only they knew what a coward I am, as I did not survive over a quarter of century in a cold and solitary cage because of my own strength. I only wish I had the strength to end this eternal nightmare long ago, but I know that I do not. No, I deserve no credit, as I know only too well that the only reason I have survived is because I didn't have a choice. All I can do each day for an infinite number of never-ending days is remind myself that each day is only one day, and no matter what might happen in that one day, it will pass, and tomorrow I will awake to yet another new day, and it too will pass. Again and again. But then there are those days such as today, as finally I can hear them somewhere off in the distance, slowly, but methodically moving my way. My coffee cup is now empty, and anxiously I stand at the front of my cell door, straining to catch that first glimpse of them coming around the far end of the wing. They are getting closer, the distant hum now becoming a more distinct sound, not unlike that of a squadron of kamikazes descending upon Pearl Harbor. only I know they are coming and I await them. Then I see them coming around the corner towards my area, about 8 wide in almost perfect formation. They are still a few hundred feet out but closing in quickly. I close my eyes and just stand there breathing and breathing until I can begin to smell them. First the overpowering stench of their exhaust, that aroma of oil mixed with gasoline that almost overpowers the now drowning wound of the formation of mowers moving across that narrow strip of grass between the wing I'm on and the next wing over, and just as quickly as they come, they are already past and moving on beyond the far corner towards the next strip of grass. But I am thankful that the noise is now fading away, as it's not the noise that I enjoy. Breathing slowly and deeply, I now find my moment that I awaited as the first scent of that freshly cut grass finally reaches me. It's funny how such a simple smell can so easily transport both body and mind far beyond this solitary cage, yet in that moment I can imagine myself back out in the real world, lying there in that freshly cut grass. Although it has not been almost 30 years since I have touched a blade of grass, in that moment I am free from the steel and stone that has entombed my body but not my mind. It is in that moment that I find the answer to that inevitable question of how I survived so long in a solitary cage. As for that one passing moment I am again free, and even once passes, I am reminded that no matter how much steel and stone man can build up around my body, they can never imprison my spirit, and it is that moment that no matter how alone I might feel, I am one with the world again. August 25, 2012. Never thought a common barnyard turkey would cause me to question my faith, but there I was that last week of November 1988, watching a small TV through the bars of my cage as President Reagan proudly performed his time-honored traditional ceremony of formally pardoning a big, white turkey there on the meticulously manicured front lawn of the White House, and yet all the while that big dumb bird just stood there completely oblivious to how the hands of fate had spared him an almost certain fate, and he would be whisked away to live happily ever after on a farm in upstate New York. Ignorance truly is bliss, and that was one blissful turkey. The irony of this is that as I watched this spectacle unfold, there I sat in a solitary cell on the bottom floor of Q Wing at Florida State Prison, only feet away from the solid steel door that led into that chamber where old Sparky awaited. I was to be executed that following Wednesday, November 30th, and unlike that lucky bird, there would be no hope for that last-minute pardon, as the politics of death eliminated any possibility of clemency. I thought a lot about that turkey over the following days, even when I feasted on one of its brethren when they brought me my holiday meal. Time is a funny thing. Mostly when we look ahead, anxiously awaiting a particular event, time drags on forever, but not on Death Watch. Each time I looked at the clock on the wall, it seemed like too much time had already passed, and with each tick that clock pushed me that much closer to my final fate. Before I knew it, there were no more days and the final 24-hour countdown was upon me. Early the morning of that last full day, the warden came down, pulled up a chair in front of my cell, and even offered me a cup of coffee. Then, with what seemed like genuine concern, the old man asked me how I was doing. I didn't expect that, and I didn't really know how to answer. I had known Warden Tom Barton for a few years and never thought of him as a friend. But there I sat face to face, separated only by a wall of steel bars, as the warden proceeded to patiently explain how my last day on earth would go. It wasn't confrontational and there was no malice in his voice. He was simply doing his job, and it wasn't necessarily a job he wanted to do. I wasn't the first one that he had this conversation with, and I wouldn't be the last. Just as the warden had explained, shortly after he left, someone else came down to measure me for the new suit they intended to kill me in. It was to be a special suit, with custom cutouts of the bottom of each leg where they would attach the electrode to the shaved area just above my ankle. I felt almost obligated to thank them, but I didn't, as they advised me that if I liked, I could also be buried in this new suit. Not long after that, the kitchen supervisor came down to ask me what I wanted for my last meal. Back then, you could order pretty much anything you wanted, and what I wanted was a pizza, a thick deep dish Sicilian-style pan pizza loaded up with everything but anchovies. And while they were at it, I asked that they throw on an extra helping of cheese, as a man cannot get enough cheese on his pizza, especially when it is his last meal. That was a long day as I anxiously waited to hear from my lawyer, hoping that the court had come to its senses and ordered my execution stopped. But that call never came, and the morning passed on into the afternoon, and then that afternoon quickly approached the evening hours. The prison had arranged for a last visit with family at 6 p.m. that evening, and I was told to get ready. For reasons I don't understand, any time a death watch prisoner was escorted from Q Wing to the front of the prison, they would lock down the entire prison, and the condemned would then be placed in full restraints and leg shackles, and led down the long hallway to the front of the prison, slowly shuffling by as countless other prisoners stared through the glass windows of the day rooms, each fully aware that they were watching a dead man walking, and even when a familiar face was spotted, their eyes would turn away. It was simply assumed that I would have that last visit, as every condemned man had a last visit, so they trussed me up and escorted me down that endless main hall and to the front where the visits would take place. I was led to a small room where the sergeant stayed with me as the lieutenant went to see who would come. It seemed like hours had passed before he returned and told me that no one was there yet, but they would wait a little longer just in case someone showed up. I wasn't that surprised, as in the almost 4 years that I had already been there, my family had only visited once and I didn't have many friends. A part of me knew that just as it was my fate to live alone, so too was it my fate to die alone. After a while, they led me back down that long hall towards my death watch cell. Nobody had come to say goodbye. Once securely in my cell again, I noticed that according to the clock on the wall, I now had less than 12 hours to go. It would be a long night. I sat silently in my cell as the guard sat just outside watching my TV. I could see through the cracks in the Venetian blinds that covered the distant window out on the catwalk that it was dark, and I remember wondering when the sun would come up and then realizing that I would be gone before it did. I was lying on my bunk silently staring up at the cracks in the ceiling of my cell when the phone on the death watch sergeant's desk suddenly rang, and I impulsively almost jumped from my bunk. I watched as the sergeant opened the gate leading into the cell block area, dragging the phone cord towards my cell, then handed the receiver to me through the bars, announcing only that it was my lawyer. Suddenly my hand was so sweaty that it was almost difficult to hold the receiver as I raised it up to my ear. "Hello," I said. My voice was low, but noticeably trembling. "Mike?" the voice asked. It was Billy Nola's, my recently appointed lawyer who I had met only once before. Cutting through the unnecessary formalities, Mr. Nolas quickly told me that the Florida Supreme Court has ordered a stay of execution. I would not die that next morning. But then he paused, and struggling to find the words, Mr. Nolas then continued, "The court denied your appeal by a 4-3 vote and only granted a 48-hour stay of execution." He didn't have to explain what that meant, as I already knew. The Florida Supreme Court didn't do me any favors. I now had less than 48 hours to write up a new federal appeal and hope that the federal court could grant relief. If not, by written order of the Florida Supreme Court, my temporary stay of execution would expire at noon on Friday, December 2, 1988, and the state of Florida would then proceed to put me to death. Although I tried to lie down again, there would be no sleep that night. Then breakfast came, and as the guard handed me my breakfast tray and a small half-pint carton of milk, I could not help but notice that the expiration date stamped on the top edge of that small carton, December 4, 1988. I was to expire before that milk. I don't know why, but that struck me deeply, branding itself into my memory. I set the milk aside, sparing it a premature death and perhaps unconsciously showing it a measure of mercy and compassion that would not be shown to me. Through the cracks in the blinds that hung over that distant window I did watch as the world outside slowly lit up in early morning light. I asked the guard if he could open those blinds so I could see outside, but was told that the blinds cannot be opened when anyone is on Phase 2 death watch for security reasons. Imagine that. Mere sunlight was somehow a threat to the security of the institution when they planned to kill a man. I couldn't actually see the sun as it rose, but it was still a beautiful sunrise. And as that nearby clock on the wall closed in on 7 a.m., I watched and held my breath in that moment, knowing only too well that was the moment I was supposed to have been put to death. But the moment passed and the clock ticked once more, and it was then 7:01 a.m. and I breathed again. Although spared that particular fate, the next was once again closing in too fast. I did not have days, as I only had hours, and just as it had been a long, sleepless night, so too would it be a long and anxious day. Shortly before lunch I again felt that distinctive hum-hum through the concrete floor that I had come to know only too well. They were once again testing the electric chair on the other side of that solid steel door to ensure that it was working properly in preparation for my once again scheduled execution. I could not hear what they were doing in that nearby room, but each time they hit the switch to send that cycle of lethal electricity to the chair, I could feel the hum on the soles of my feet as it raced through the floor, and knew what it was, as did the officer and sergeant who sat nearby. Then there would be silence. A long and unnatural silence, as if the world was holding its breath. Even the seemingly ever-present pigeons outside went eerily silent, but nobody said a word, and then just as quickly that moment passed and we all went back to what we were doing as if nothing had happened. Although a part of me knew that my assigned lawyer was already down in Fort Lauderdale desperately assembling that crucial habeas appeal that had to be hastily handwritten and presented to the federal court before the stay of execution expired at noon on Friday, I still sat there alone, struggling with the lack of knowledge and the uncertainty of my still undecided fate, and it was that not knowing whether I would live or die that made my day unbearable. But that day did slowly pass, and once again night approached and that world outside the cracks in those blinds went dark again. That was Wednesday night, November 30th, 1988, and that was the day God died. I had not slept in days and I would not sleep that night. I cannot begin to describe how overwhelmed and abandoned I felt, and in those hours as I sat alone I knew that even God had abandoned me. I knew only too well that if the federal court denied that request for a full stay of execution, then I would die. Perhaps my hope had already died as I found myself not only struggling with my faith, but with even accepting my fate. And then there was that damn turkey that I just could not get out of my head. Perhaps if only I had committed the crime I was convicted of and condemned to die for, I could have embraced my fate as the will of God, but I knew that I had not. Please check out www.southerninjustice.com. The depth of my despair was and continues to be beyond comprehension, as I could not understand how it was at the age of 28, in 1988, I sat in that solitary cell only a few feet away from the solid steel door that led into the execution chamber while the final hours of my mortal existence methodically slipped away. How could this be? At the 6th hour darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, and at the 9th hour Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Elio, Elio, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? NIV, Mark 15, 33-34. From the time that I was old enough to remember, I never once questioned whether God existed. I was always taught that He did, and in the earliest days of Sunday school I was told that God created Santa Claus, which explained the miraculous manifestation of presents under the tree to celebrate the birth of Jesus, so I knew that God had to exist. While growing up in the suburbs at Marin County, California, it was our Sunday morning family tradition to dress up in our best and pile up in the station wagon, and off to church we would go. Following the service we would jump back into the wagon and often head over to my grandparents' house on the shores of San Pablo Bay. For those unfamiliar, the northern part of San Francisco Bay, just up from the infamous San Quentin State Prison, for a Sunday brunch. Grandpa would say grace as we all gathered around to eat, carefully avoiding the cardinal sin of staining our starched white shirts and yet seeming to always find a way to do so. From the very first day that I attended grade school, the entire class would stand as one as we recited the Pledge of Allegiance, proudly crossing our hearts and pledging our faith and loyalty to both God and country. After school would come our scout meetings, where once again we would stand united and swear our oath to God. How could I have any doubt that this God existed when nothing in my early life ever compelled me to question this existence? But what is faith if it is never truly tested? And where do we draw the line between the intellectual indoctrination of belief and a true faith and understanding of God? In the years to come, I would search for answers and a truth I could believe in. But in that moment, in my heart, I had only the God that I was taught to believe in and a God that in my heart and very soul I truly did believe in. I now know that the more profound truth is, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, if there wasn't a God, man would have to create one. I now know the substantial distinction between the God that we create out of our inherent need to commune with something greater than us, and a God of spiritual substance beyond that taught to a child. When I look back today and read the words I had written long ago in a futile attempt to define my own spirituality, life is the mortal condemnation of an eternal soul, I smile. How simplistic, how pathetically convenient, and yet, how true, but completely inadequate in the years that followed, as I have discovered that life itself is a spiritual journey and that with each experience we encounter, our spirituality evolves. What we once believed without question as a child now humors us as we've grown. The God that I believed in as a child, the God that I was taught to never question, died the night of November 30, 1988, and yet in that death arose something far greater that remains and continues to evolve. There I was that night, exhausted and overwhelmed, both psychologically and physically, and I did not recall actually falling asleep. But in my attempt to understand what next transpired, I must assume that I did. Nothing ever before and never since has seemed so real as that light that completely enveloped me as I was catapulted into complete consciousness. The cell that I was in and all the tangible steel and stone that surrounded me disappeared, and that light engulfed all that was. I cannot explain it, nor can I deny it. There, as I lay on that bunk, a beaten and broken man forced to confront my own mortality, that unexplainable light appeared, and in that moment I felt not pain or despair, but an overwhelming and all-consuming sense of peace and tranquility. And although not an audible word was spoken, I heard a voice that then assured me that it would all be all right and that I was not alone, that I never would be alone. I felt the presence of God. Not that indoctrinated image I was taught to intellectually believe in, but a spiritual presence that in that instance instilled within me the knowledge that whether I would live or die, did not matter, as my mortal existence was just a small step on this eternal journey, and that there was something far greater awaiting me beyond this physical prison we dare to call life. For the first time, I knew with absolute certainty and a spiritual clarify beyond that words can possibly convey, that God did exist, but that it was not this God that man has manipulated and conveniently created in our own image, that not only I, but that all of us truly are created in His image, but that image is not the churches we build on or the idols we create. It is one of a spiritual consciousness that transcends our mortality. We are all one, and that one is of all. I spent the rest of that night in that death watch cell sitting quietly at the edge of my bunk, but I no longer felt overwhelmed by despair and hopelessness and no longer tormented myself with the uncertainty of my fate. Rather, my now imminent execution became irrelevant, and I sat there only trying to understand that experience. Then morning came and I ate like I hadn't eaten in months, and I drank that little carton of milk without any further thought of that expiration date stamped upon it. The death watch sergeant noticed the change in my attitude and demeanor and came over to the cell front and talked to me. It was a long conversation of no substance, and I cannot recall what was said, but it didn't really matter. Something within me had changed, even transformed, and it was projected outward. Again, I spent that day of Thursday, December 1, 1988, there in that death watch cell awaiting word from my lawyers as to whether I would live or die, but it no longer mattered. That sense of peace and tranquility became part of me, and I wasn't abandoned or afraid. I knew that, although in a solitary cell, I was not alone. The day passed on into the evening, and the evening gave way to the night, and no word had yet come. Time ticked on my temporary stay of execution, which was to automatically expire at noon that following day. But that night I lay down on my bunk and I slept, and although it may very well have been my last night in this mortal life, I slept like a baby. The following morning, what was to be my last morning, was just another morning. The warden came down to talk to me again, and only did I find out that even if the federal court denied my stay of execution, they had no plans to carry out my execution that day, as it was a Friday, so the warden told me that it would be early that next week, and remarkably, I was all right with that. Later that morning the phone call came, and my lawyer advised me that the federal district judge Williams Locke had entered an emergency order, granting me a full stay of execution, and went to extraordinary lengths to have that order served upon all parties to ensure that my execution would not be carried out. Within hours I was removed from death watch and moved back to the regular death row wing among the men that I came to regard as my family. In the coming years that followed, I often struggled to understand my experience and attempted to share that experience with others, such as in the book Welcome to Hell, edited/compiled by Jan W. Arians, 1991. But I found that most are at best unreceptive, and often even hostile. I learned to keep my experience to myself and find comfort in the knowledge that what I felt was real. Those few who knew me best before I was placed on death watch and the person I was, and am, after that experience know this has transformed me at a fundamental level. I am not a holy roller, nor am I compelled to force my faith upon others, as few can understand why that dogmatic structurism of organized religion simply doesn't matter. The physical churches and pretentious congregations are not what God is about. They are merely manifestations of our futile attempt to understand God in that image we have so desperately created. Only when one confronts and overcomes that intellectual indoctrination of what we are taught to believe God is, and embraces the spiritual essence and substance of what God truly is, can one then find true peace and tranquility and continue on this eternal journey of spiritual evolution. I write this today only because someone familiar with what I wrote about my experience many years ago asked me how I felt this affected who I am today. And the answer is an easy one. I am still a mortal man condemned by the imperfections that plague us all. And perhaps that is all I will be in this life. Regretfully, I still respond in anger when I know I have the strength to rise above it, and I still succumb to the temptations and weaknesses that inherently define our humanity. Quite simply, I remain an imperfect man in an imperfect world struggling to justify my condemnation. But the reality is that we are all condemned, and at the end of the day, mortal death is an absolute certainty. Nobody gets out alive. But even as much as that unique spiritual experience remains a part of me and always will, there's also a part of me that now feels betrayed by that implied promise that was never kept, and after all these years, almost a quarter century now since that death watch experience, I remain in a solitary cell on Florida's death row, still condemned to death for a crime I know I did not commit, and my mortal fate remains uncertain. When I realize that, I do again feel an increasing bitterness towards the never-ending injustice so deliberately perpetuated against me, and anger towards the malicious mistreatment of all of us here on death row. I find myself questioning my experience, but when I do, I find confirmation and that sense of peace and tranquility, and I'm reminded that it's all right to question my faith, as only when faith is truly tested can it remain a true faith. November 9, 2012. Each year, on November 11th, we proudly celebrate Veterans Day, honoring those who served our country and were willing to sacrifice their lives to protect our freedom and liberty. Our veterans deserve this honor, and as a society, their selfless service is not so easily forgotten, or at least until they dare to cross that line and become a convicted felon. And when our heroes fall from grace, we quickly abandon them. As an honorable discharged disabled veteran myself, I know only too well how quickly our society will abandon those who served. I am not a hero, and I never served in any war. For the brief period of time that I served, I was merely an average soldier doing his job. But in the many years that I've now been on Florida's death row, I have met a number of genuine heroes, men who did fight in combat and were once honored with both physical scars and medals. Until that moment they become convicted felons, they were true American heroes, and worthy of our respect. Funny how quickly we as a society will turn our backs on those who fought and were willing to die for us. It's something we should all be ashamed of. These men may have committed crimes, and for that they will be punished through our legal system. Nobody can dispute that there must be accountability, but rather the real question is what measure of mitigation should attach when one of our military veterans crosses that line and commits a crime? Only too often these veterans who become convicted felons are themselves a victim of the horrors of war, and yet nobody seems to care. A few years ago, the United States Supreme Court had to intervene to stop the execution of Korean War veteran George Porter. Please see Porter v. McCollum, 130 S. 447, 2009. His case is indicative of just how little respect these fallen heroes get once our society turns their back on them. The facts are beyond dispute and graphically described by the Supreme Court. When George Porter was only 17 years old, he lied to a military recruiter about his age so that he could enlist in the Army. At the time, the Korean War was being fought, and George knew that he would be sent to fight on the front lines. Many brutal, but now forgotten, battles were fought, and too many American soldiers died on that Korean peninsula. By law, not even a man yet, George was assigned to the 8th Army as it drove north of the 34th parallel under General M.C. Cuther. It was a bloody war made even more miserable by the cold winter. George sustained his first injury when he was shot in battle and was medevaced to the field hospital. For that, he was later awarded a Purple Heart. Most other soldiers would have used that injury as a ticket back home. But not George. He came to Korea to fight for a country that he proudly believed in, and going home wasn't on his agenda until that fight was over. George insisted that despite his injury he be allowed to return to his brothers in arms, and was transferred back up to the front lines. Anybody familiar with the history of the Korean War knows that being part of the 8th Army during its drive north of the 34th parallel during those dark days of that war was no place to be. It was during that campaign that China decided they didn't want American troops pushing north near their border, and in a sneak attack comparable to Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, China ordered its massive army south into Korea. The 8th Army never had a chance. At that point, it was no longer a war. It was a slaughter. The Army made the decision to retreat, leaving many American soldiers already overcome by the Chinese there to die. George was part of the company left behind and one of the very few who lived to tell about it. But George never really talked about it. Sometimes the only way to cope with the past is to try to put it out of your mind. George received another Purple Heart for the substantial injuries he suffered in that battle, and this time he was sent back home. But the physical injuries of combat only too often become relatively insignificant when compared to the mental damage done. Commonly known now as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, many soldiers who have fought in combat suffer psychological trauma that impairs their ability to adjust back into what most would call a normal life. George came home a genuine decorated American hero, but he never got a hero's welcome, and he never asked for one. His civilian life over the next 30 years was relatively unremarkable, except for his inability to escape from the never-ending nightmares of the horrors of that forgotten war. Through these years George tried to drown these dark memories in alcohol, and perhaps succeeded for the most part. But then came that day when George found himself caught up in a love triangle and, by his account, while intoxicated, confronted his girlfriend about the tryst, and one thing led to another, with the confrontation spontaneously escalating into the woman being shot to death. George later pled guilty to murder and threw himself on the mercy of the court. But our courts don't often show mercy. as judges can't win local elections by being soft on crime. George woke up sober in Florida's death row. As the too many years passed, his lawyers attempted to get the courts to recognize that George's combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder should mitigate his sentence, but both the state courts and then the federal courts summarily denied his arguments, finding that his military service and the fact he was a decorated war hero was irrelevant, and would not have made any difference in deciding whether he should be put to death. It has been said that the Supreme Court is the court of the last resort, and for good reason, as once a condemned man has exhausted all of his state and federal appeals before the lower courts, only if the Supreme Court steps in will the inevitable execution be stopped. But it is very rare for the Supreme Court to do so, and filing an appeal before that court is the last act of a desperate man. George's lawyers filed their appeal, knowing only too well that the odds of the court granting review would be extremely long. Given the tragic history of George's life, nobody would have called him lucky, but against all odds, the Supreme Court did accept George's case for review, and in a subsequent scathing opinion, a unanimous Supreme Court strongly admonished the lower state and federal courts for reducing to irrelevancy George's well-documented and indisputable military history. Even the most conservative, pro-death penalty justices, Scalia and Thomas, joined in the unanimous decision vacating George's death sentence. It still took a few more years before the state of Florida announced that it would not attempt to have the death sentence against George Porter reinstated, and George is now serving life in a Florida prison. Now almost 80 years old, it is very likely that George will die in prison even though he has been eligible for parole many years now. But the state of Florida remains embarrassed by the Supreme Court's condemnation of their actions and has aggressively opposed any consideration for parole. Not all escape from their fate as George did. Many years ago, when I was relatively new to death row, I came to know a man by name of David Fuches, as he lived on the same tier as me. He wasn't that popular on the row. Not too many wanted to live around Dave as he had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night screaming in terror of the ghosts that always haunted him. Sometimes the guards would have to intervene when Dave would crawl up under his bunk and blockade himself with a steel footlocker, yelling for everyone else to get down. David Fuches was a broken man with a long history of psychological problems that he brought back with him from his tour of duty in Vietnam. Like too many others, the horrors of war took its toll on him and he never really came home. Before he snapped and was convicted of capital murder, his neighbors in Gainesville told how after returning from Vietnam, Dave was a changed man. Often he would be found in a foxhole he dug in his yard. For Dave, the Vietnam War never ended. A few years after I came to the row, the state of Florida put David Fuches to death. His lawyers valiantly tried to convince the courts that they must take into consideration Dave's clearly documented mental history, PTSD, that he suffered after serving in combat in the Vietnam War, but the courts didn't want to hear it. What must be understood is that the death penalty is supposed to be imposed only upon the worst of the worst, and by law both the sentencing jury and court must evaluate evidence of aggravation, factors that make that particular murder worse than others, and mitigators, factors that would support an argument why a sentence less than death should be imposed. Only if the jury and the court, in Florida, the jury hears the evidence relevant to sentencing and makes a recommendation of either life or death, but the judge subsequently makes the actual decision, find that the aggravators substantially outweigh any mitigation, can a sentence of death be imposed. Most people are familiar with criminal cases in which the convicted defendant argues for a lenient sentence because of childhood abuse, or substance dependency, drug or alcohol addiction, or other factors that would arguably render that person less culpable, or less deserving of death. For example, if someone had a history of drug addiction and decides to rob a liquor store to get money for more drugs, and in the course of the robbery, blew the store manager's brains out for no apparent reason but that he didn't get the money quick enough, upon conviction his lawyers would argue that he cannot be sentenced to death because he had a really lousy childhood that resulted in drug abuse, And since he was stoned when he committed the murder, he was under substantial psychological duress. Under applicable law, the court is required to recognize those factors as mitigating and that defendant might get a reduced sentence. But not a single state in America that still has the death penalty has any statutorily defined mitigating criteria for an argument for a reduced sentence, life instead of death, if the convicted man or woman served in the military and because of that military service suffered either a physical or psychological injury that contributed to the commission of the alleged crime. A hero is only a hero as long as our society recognizes them. Those veterans who fall from grace are only too quickly forgotten, and apparently very few people out there even care. In all the years that I've been in prison now, I have never, not even once, seen any mainstream media outlet, i.e., newspaper, television, etc., do a story about these fallen heroes, and prisons are full of them. When it comes down to it, if a cold-blooded killer has had a tragic childhood and voluntarily consumed drugs, there's a really good chance that he, or she, will be spared the death penalty. But someone who proudly served his, or her, country, often in a time of war, and suffered a physical or psychological disability that might have contributed to the commission of the crime gets no recognition. Through the years, a number of combat veterans have been put to death here in Florida. In addition to David Fuches, Florida has also executed at least 2 other Vietnam veterans, Larry Joe Johnson and Dennis Arthur Rutherford. Even assuming for the sake of this argument they were guilty of the alleged crime, in each of these cases the courts refused to recognize their honorable service to their country during a time of war as a mitigating factor that might have spared their life. But this long history of callously turning our backs on military veterans who have fallen from grace by being convicted of a crime goes far beyond the relatively few military veterans who now populate death rows across the country. The truth is that prisons across the country currently hold tens of thousands of military veterans, whose society has turned their back on. These men and women proudly and honorably volunteered to fight and die to protect the liberty and freedoms most take for granted, and only too often the trauma they suffered during their service to our country left them broken. But nobody cares about them. As I said, I am myself a legally recognized disabled military veteran, but I am not a war hero and I personally ask for no recognition. But because of my unique status as a disabled veteran, I know only too well that these genuine heroes go through once they are thrown into prisons and so quickly abandoned and forgotten. To illustrate how military veterans are treated once they enter our prison system, I can only use my own well-documented history, which is indicative of the indifference our society has towards incarcerated veterans. Many moons ago in a life now far, far away, I met a girl in high school and we patiently waited until we were of age, 18, and then got married at the Polk County Courthouse in Florida. Like most young couples, we struggled financially and so we decided that I would do as my 2 older brothers already did, and join the Army. The pay wouldn't be great, but we had dreams and the military had medical care for my then pregnant wife and a chance to earn benefits that would allow me to go to college. I signed up and was shipped off to boot camp at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My military service was remarkably uneventful. I was just another soldier and nothing more. At that time, the Vietnam War was already over and the country was at peace. It was just a job. If you can call operating the computer guidance system for a battery of 185 howitzers just a job. In November 1978, while on routine duty, I was knocked backward down a flight of concrete stairs and pretty much woke up at the base hospital. The accident caused substantial injury to my lower back and I spent a while in the hospital before being discharged. After about a month of physical therapy, the powers that be decided I was no longer fit for military duty and threw me out with a plane ticket back home. Because of this injury, I was not able to work. Often I couldn't even get out of bed. Since I was discharged from duty, I no longer had access to medical care and was told I would have to apply for a disability benefit separately, but it would take a while, possibly even years. My only available form of pain relief was to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs, which led to its own problems. By 21 I was divorced, and by 22 I was on my way to Florida's death row. Please see www.southerninjustice.com. In the free world, the Military Veterans Administration provides one of the most comprehensive healthcare systems in America, and for the most part provides above-average care for veterans, especially for those who have suffered a physical or psychological injury while serving their country. But under applicable federal law, once a veteran is sentenced to a state prison, he or she is no longer eligible for the federally funded veterans' health care, and so incarcerated veterans receive the same basic, minimal, health care available to all other prisoners. The state prison system is constitutionally required to provide adequate health care to all prisoners. But just what is adequate is subject to liberal interpretation, especially in recent years where all state prison budgets are cut to the bone and funding for medical care is cut further and further each fiscal year. Whether one receives adequate medical treatment for a legitimate medical problem in our prison system often comes down to whether that particular prison doctor chooses to recognize the medical condition. These administrators are often provided substantial personal incentive not to recognize legitimate medical conditions in the form of generous bonuses they receive based upon the percentage of money they save. Quite simply, by refusing to recognize the medical condition, they are relieved of any legal obligation to provide treatment. For well over 20 years, the prison system recognized my physical disability and provided treatment. But then the budget cuts started coming, and each year the prison medical budget was substantially less. Attempts to receive even the basic treatment became a battle that had to be fought again and again. To compound this problem, I'm not getting any younger, and as I age, my physical disability becomes progressively worse. But if the prison medical staff actually recognizes the progressive nature of my physical disability, then they would be legally obligated to treat it, which could cost substantially more money. There are many federal laws that supposedly serve to protect disabled persons, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and even the Military Veterans Administration, which has statutory power to intervene if a disabled veteran is not receiving adequate treatment. But all these legal protections are dependent upon these agencies actually willing to intervene, and they are not. As my physical disability progressively becomes worse, it has substantially impeded my ability to go to outdoor recreation, especially even though legally recognized as physically disabled. I am physically restrained, handcuffed, behind the back anytime I leave my death row cell, making it all but impossible to go up or down stairs that lead to the death row recreation yard. For several years I was not able to go to the recreation yard as I simply could not go up and down the stairs, and the prison took the position that my long-recognized disability had somehow miraculously healed itself, so a medical pass that would have allowed me to be front-cuffed so I could go up or down the stairs was no longer necessary. They say you can't fight City Hall, but fighting against a prison bureaucracy is by far a bigger battle. In recent years I have written countless letters to various organizations that claim to provide advocacy for military veterans, and each one without exception responded in the same manner: they do not and will not involve themselves with veterans who are incarcerated in state prisons. Just as many letters were sent to many lawyers all but begging for help, as if I had a lawyer willing to take the indifference to my physical disability to court. I could compel prison officials to provide adequate treatment and access to the recreation yard, but not even one lawyer was willing to assist. Even more troubling is that although there are countless organizations that provide services and assistance to military veterans in the free world, there is not even one organization willing to assist incarcerated veterans who are being denied necessary medical treatment relating to a service-connected physical disability or psychiatric condition. It has been my documented experience that even state agencies that are responsible for ensuring disabled military veterans receive adequate care simply will not intervene on behalf of incarcerated veterans. But I again want to emphasize that this is not about me. Rather, My case only illustrates how as a society we do deliberately turn our backs on the military veterans who fall from grace. Whether it's the indisputable refusal to recognize a war hero's service to his country as legitimate mitigation when deciding whether he, or she, should be sentenced to death, or the way our society turns its back on disabled veterans who are incarcerated, this says a lot about who we are as a society, and I would like to think we are better than that. In today's world, more military veterans than even before are coming home from war with substantial trauma, and some of those heroes will find themselves in a situation that leads to a criminal conviction and incarceration. As we recognize Veterans Day, perhaps we should take a moment to also remember the many now abandoned and forgotten military veterans who are imprisoned, and ask ourselves whether these fallen heroes deserve something better than to be forgotten by a society that they were only too willing to fight and die to protect. If they were willing to give their life for us, don't we owe them something more than simply turning our backs on them when they need us the most? December 15, 2012. At this time of year I find myself wondering what Christmas has become. For almost 30 years now, I have been in continuous solitary confinement, condemned to death. Here on Florida's death row there are no shopping malls or shiny decorations that have come to define the holidays in the real world. I can watch it all on my TV, and if what I'm watching is what Christmas out there in the real world is, then maybe I'm more fortunate than those who have been consumed by commercialism and have lost sight of what it should mean. What are we really celebrating at this time of year? Don't get me wrong, I would give almost anything to spend Christmas with my children and grandchildren, and see that magic sparkle in their eyes as they rip open brightly colored packages stacked beneath a beautifully decorated Christmas tree. And what very little I might still have left afterwards, I would willingly surrender to, if only I could spend Christmas Day gathered around Mom's table with long-lost family as we share a traditional meal while basking in the glow of each other's company, as those are the moments that memories are made of. But for me, Christmas will be spent in a cage and there won't be any warm hearth, or gifts beneath a tree. I will spend my holiday alone just as I have done for too many Christmases past. And although it may be difficult for others to understand, I still feel blessed to celebrate Christmas in my own way. I came to Florida's death row in March of 1984, and it's that first Christmas on the row that I look back upon and remember. That was a very hard year. In that first year, there were 8 men here on the row put to death, one almost every month, and at a time when there was barely 100 of us here. That number now has increased to almost 400. With executions averaging 2 yearly. With so many facing imminent executions, the stench of death practically hung over all of us like a toxic cloud, threatening to suffocate us. My cell neighbor had been on the row for about 8 years at the time, and throughout that first year James, J.D., Rollerson looked out for me and, as only condemned men living in close proximity can, we became as close as family. He took me under his wing and generously and kindly showed me the ropes. But just before the holidays, the Florida governor signed a death warrant on J.D., and he was taken away to the death watch area to await execution. His Christmas would be spent alone on the bottom floor of Florida State Prison's infamous Q wing, a few feet away from the door that leads into the execution chamber, and the following month, J.D. was executed. Although I had sat in my death row cell as 8 others were each put to death, and executions were not unfamiliar to me, by the time that first Christmas on the row rolled around and J.D. was moved to death watch, it hit especially close to home. He was the first one that I was actually close to, though far too many others I came to later know as both friends and brothers would follow through the years. That first Christmas on the row was especially hard in part because I still held on to the more traditional way in which most celebrate this holiday. I missed being able to be with my loved ones, and I could only wonder how my children might be spending their Christmas that year as I had no way to communicate with them, and hadn't heard from them since my arrest in early 1983. But that doesn't mean that my family and friends were not in thought, and each night I anxiously waited for the mail to come in, hoping upon hope that maybe, just maybe, I might get a card or letter, but those cards and letters didn't come. Even as alone a condemned man might feel in that solitary cage, that physical isolation becomes a distant second to the overwhelming sense of abandonment one feels as each day ever so very slowly drags by, and that mail you so anxiously hope will come, doesn't, and each day without a word pushes you down further into an abyss of hopelessness and despair that slowly kills you from within, one small cut at a time. Today I can look back and understand what I could not back then, that what I felt was not at all unique amongst those I lived around. It is part of the experience we all feel on the row. When it comes down to it, those who love and care about us in the world don't know how to handle our death sentences. When that sentence is imposed, there's a presumption of finality not unlike what families experience when they learn a loved one has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even those who truly do love us often become uncomfortable and distant, unable to cope with the impending loss of someone they love. For them, there is the added stigma of having a loved one convicted of a heinous crime in the very community they, our families, must continue to live in. It took me many years to see beyond the misery of my own circumstance and come to understand that even as hard as it might be on me, my conviction and condemnation was at least just as hard on those I left behind. For the many months of that first year, J.D. was my mentor and source of support, and then he was gone. Many mornings I would awake, still expecting to see his arm reaching around that concrete wall that separated our cells, extending a cup of coffee or perhaps some kind of snack, his way of inviting me to get up and talk a while. Although we couldn't physically see each other, as each solitary cell was only open at the front, facing outward, being able to stand there at the front of the cell and talk around that wall was a very real sense of communion that we shared. Just that quickly, it was no more, and in that month leading up to that first Christmas, that cell remained empty, leaving me all but isolated, as the man on my other side chose to keep to himself and would rarely talk at all. Perhaps I have always struggled with depression, although I can't help but wonder who wouldn't if thrown into a solitary cell facing the reality of death all around you. But that first Christmas had me feeling especially abandoned and overwhelmed, and I became almost obsessed with questioning the why of it all. Finding few answers, I contemplated whether I should take the easy way out, and if I could find the strength to commit suicide. I did think about the many ways that might be accomplished, and, as those thoughts too often invaded my overwhelming isolation, the person that I was back then would have welcomed an end to what has become an ongoing nightmare. That Christmas of 1984 was on a Tuesday, just as it will be this year, 2012, and when the cards and letters I hoped to receive didn't come by that last weekend before Christmas, like too many others around me, I clung on to the hope that they would come that Monday, Christmas Eve. Then that Monday came, and I was not the only one on the wing who silently stood at his cell door hoping upon whatever measure of hope remained that this night before Christmas would miraculously bring that one card or letter from a loved one. It was almost a collective ritual, as each of us anxiously watched that clock in anticipation for mail call. We strained to hear the sound of those heavy brass keys as the guard came down to open the inner catwalk gate that led into the cell block area, where he would slowly work his way down the wing, one cell at a time, passing out the mail. The whole floor went quiet as each of us anxiously waited for what we might receive. As the guard approached my cell that night, he stopped, and I'm sure in that moment my heart skipped a beat as I held my breath like a child would if confronted by Santa Claus. I watched as the guard looked down on his small stack of mail and silently picked up the top one, then unceremoniously laid that one plain white envelope on my door and without a word, walked away towards the next cell. I picked that envelope up from my door and looked to see from who it might be, but there was no name or return address. I then looked at the postmark and could see that it was mailed from Key Largo, Florida a few days earlier, but I didn't know anyone down in Key Largo. A small piece of Scotch tape had been used to seal the envelope, and I pulled it apart, then carefully reached in to pull the card out. It was just a plain card sporting a modestly decorative pattern on the front, with gold print letters that read, "Happy Holidays," and inside, A generic wish that the season would be joyful and not much more. But then I read what was written inside, just 3 simple words, and that was all. "I forgive you," signed E. Banner. There was a moment of confusion before that sank in, and then I realized what I was holding, and I involuntarily sunk down upon my bunk. Sitting in silence, I stared at that simple card for what may very well have been hours as the passage of time became irrelevant. "I forgive you." That simple card was from the mother of the victim in the case for which I now sat on death row. I recognized the name from court documents, and as I understood it, Chip was her only child. Throughout my trial, she never came to court, and unlike the family of the young woman who also died that night, Ms. Banner never campaigned for or demanded my death as the only acceptable measure of justice. I didn't sleep that Christmas Eve and carefully laid that simple card up on my small bookshelf, and that night I laid there alone, and in the darkness and solitude that surrounded me, I cried for the first time in too many years, and then I got down on my knees and prayed to a God that I had given up on. That night I found the words, and in my own incoherent way, I thanked him for that card, and asked him to touch Ms. Banner in a special way. Not much is ever written about the personal persecution of condemned men, but I'd like to think that I am not the only one who has often struggled with an overwhelming sense of remorse for the tragedy that has touched too many lives. But we live in a world in which the qualities that define what is good in humanity are only too rare, and a condemned man reaching out to ask for forgiveness is met with a heavy hand of scorn and impassioned vengeance. How dare we ask, much less expect such? But that card was sent on her own, from something within her, a quality that I can only stand in awe and respect of, as in my entire life I have known so very few people who had the strength and moral character to rise above their own personal loss and suffering to reach out with such compassion and forgiveness. What made this act of unsolicited compassion especially remarkable is that she did not know what had actually happened that night that tragically resulted in her son's death. She knew only what the prosecutor had told her, which now, many years later, has been revealed as fabrication. See www.southerninjustice.com. When she wrote out that simple card, she had every reason to believe that I had deliberately taken the life of her child. In the years since, it has been revealed that the prosecutor deliberately manipulated and concealed crucial evidence while coercing false testimony that would have substantiated my consistently pled claim of being involuntarily compelled to act in self-defense. For this reason, that simple card meant so much, and as I sat in that solitary cell that night before Christmas, I received a gift that I could not have imagined, beyond even that measure of mercy and compassion we all wish to receive from our fellow man, especially when we find ourselves alone and overwhelmed and feeling like the whole world is against us. There is no greater gauge of our humanity than summoning the strength to forgive another, and it's a quality that is tragically too rare. As that Christmas came and went, that card remained on my bookshelf, and countless times every day I would pick it up and read it again, and I thought about how incredibly hard it had to be for her to write those 3 words, "I forgive you." That Christmas card was, for me, the very definition of Christmas. So many get lost in the materialism of this spiritual holiday. But then there are these moments when the magic of Christmas shines through, and in these moments we are blessed with the gift of being reminded of what Christmas is really about, and our faith in humanity can be renewed even under the darkest circumstances. Few of us seem to find that measure of strength within ourselves to forgive another, but I do believe that strength is within each of us, and knowing only too well how that simple Christmas card touched me on that Christmas so many years ago, it is my wish today that each of us can find that strength within ourselves. March 16, 2013. The funny thing about not having a future is that you tend to spend way too much time thinking about the past and all those distorted memories of the life you might have once had. It doesn't take too much to think back to those better days, and when you've spent as much time in a solitary cell as I have over the past 3 decades, your attempt to hold on to those past memories too often begin to blend into the world you're now trapped in, and the present becomes one with that past in the strongest of ways. Most recently, it was a simple question posed by a friend, asking me what it was like when I first came to Florida's death row so long ago. She wanted me to tell her how I felt that first day and what my initial impressions were. I suppose that was a simple enough question. But how does one look back through the many years and describe that first moment when the world he once knew ceased to exist, and as if awakening to a nightmare, he steps into a virtual man-made hell that few could even begin to imagine? As I struggle with a way to answer that simple question, my thoughts drift back to a time in my early teens when living in the San Francisco Bay Area where I was born and raised. A friend's father had just bought a new boat and we all begged to go along as he took that cabin cruiser out that very first time. We began our trip early that morning at a marina in San Rafael, not too far from where San Quentin State Prison looked out over the bay, just a short distance from the Richmond Bridge that joined Marin and Alameda countries. Side by side with my friend, I stood proudly at the bow of the boat, our knuckles clenched tightly to that stainless steel rail as the water broke beneath us. We skirted southward around the bay towards that narrow passage between the sparsely populated hills of Tiburon and Larkspur, and the infamous and ironically named Angel Island, where Japanese Americans were involuntarily interned during the World War II, and then towards the mouth of Richardson Bay where the funky houseboats around Sausalito then lay anchor, and our captain, oh captain, proudly leaned down on his horns. We then swung southward again, crossing the bay in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge with those twin engines gunned as we fought the current that had swept many a lesser boat out to the sea and back up into the bay along the bunks of what was once Crissy Field at the Presidio, past the stuffy St. Francis Yacht Club, on towards Fisherman's Wharf and the ferry terminal. By then it was approaching mid-morning, and, as is so common on those early days, thick banks of drifting fog rolled in across the bay just as we turned in towards Alcatraz Island. At that time I had heard many stories about that island, but had never seen it up close before. The boat had slowed to barely a crawl, inching its way towards that bellowing foghorn, and we remained on point, straining to see through those drifting bunks of seemingly impenetrable fog, and then suddenly, there it was directly in front of us, the towering castle-like monstrosity that is Alcatraz, rising from the depths of the sea. As we slowly flanked the island, everyone on the boat was silent, each of us looking up towards that abandoned monument of human misery, and with the sun still rising over the distant hills behind the island, that late morning light cast strange shadows from the broken windows of that fortress-like cell block that topped the island so as that one could almost see the faceless figures of those long-forgotten convicts who once made that infamous rock what it was. Now, I imagines, their tortured souls stood a silent vigil, perhaps also looking out towards a life they once had. We had all heard the stories of the deprivation and the desperation of the men condemned to that island hell, and how the federal government had closed and all but abandoned the island after a daring and fateful midnight escape that proved the seemingly inescapable prison had its weaknesses after all. The stories told around our scout campfires hinted that those desperate convicts may had made it off the island, but they didn't leave the water alive, and there in the dead of the night out on the bay, the tortured souls of these ghosts still cry out as they were forever condemned to drift in endless circles around Alcatraz, never to set foot on dry land again. But for all the stories that I might had heard, and even when I think back to that morning when I first saw for myself that soulless steel and stone miscreation floating in the bay between those thick banks of ghostly fog, never once, not even in my worst childhood nightmare, could I have imagined how my own destiny would one day closely parallel that of those lost souls, and I too would go on to become one of those faceless figures standing in the shadows of the shattered windows of an only too similar cold concrete and steel monstrosity, maliciously designed to methodically break the will of even the strongest of men. It had been about 10 years, almost to the day, since that prophetic boat trip when that plain windowless white van pulled up to the heavy steel gates at the backside of Florida State Prison to deliver its human cargo. I sat alone, shackled and chained in a cage in the back, as I was the cargo. only the day before I'd been sentenced to death. That was March 22, 1984, and although seemingly so long ago, I can still remember it as if that was yesterday. My journey into this man-made hell had begun many hours before we finally approached the gates leading into this beast known as Florida State Prison, and I already knew only too well that FSP wasn't just any prison. It was the end of the line, and it was here that I had been delivered to die. Only those condemned to death come straight to FSP, as all others commonly graduate to this prison after screwing up at other institutions and proving they cannot be housed anywhere else. For that reason, FSP had come to be known as the Alcatraz of the South, where convicts only came when they couldn't be sent anywhere else. There wasn't a prisoner in the South who didn't fear the place or know its reputation for violence, and death was by no means an exaggeration. There I sat in that van, in the heart of what was known as the Iron Triangle, that area of northwest Florida around the town of Stark, where at least 6 state prisons formed the backbone of an industry imprisoning society's outcasts. Just across the way, and yet in another county altogether, stood the Rock of Rayford, made famous in a few Humphrey Bogart movies. As I now know, the local industry dates back to 1913, when Florida built a few temporary stockades on 18,000 acres of land they had purchased at $5 an acre. At that time, it was called the State Prison Farm and was intended to accommodate only those prisoners the state could not sell to private businesses, which was the practice even after slavery was abolished. By 1919, hundreds of both male and female convicts worked together to farm about 4,000 acres of crops and run a shoe factory that put out about 10 pairs of shoes a day. The state hired a superintendent and about 40 guards who were paid $35 a month plus room and board. But in 1923, then Governor Hardy put a stop to the time-honored practice of selling state prisoners for labor. For the first time, all convicted felons in Florida had to be sent to a state prison. By 1928, the infamous rock known as Rayford State Prison was built near the original stockades, and a license tag factory put them to work. Once the construction of state prisons began, it never stopped. Soon more buildings were constructed to house even more prisoners, and on it grew. By the 1950s, Florida decided it was time to have their own maximum security prison, where convicts who couldn't be housed anywhere else could be warehoused and a death house could be built. Florida State Prison was born the same year I was, 1960. Originally considered an extension of the Rock, it was commonly called the East Unit, but the unlucky convicts who called it home knew it for what it was, the Alcatraz of the South. By the time I arrived, FSP had already earned its reputation as a hell beyond comprehension. As I now look back to that early spring day of March 1984, I can't help but think of the classic Dante's Inferno, and how the imaginary friend journeyed down with the condemned man through those 9 rings of hell. As much as I might wish I had my own imaginary guide to accompany me down and down, I already knew that it would be my fate to make this journey alone, even though I too was about to descend into an inferno beyond the comprehension. To be able to now merge the man I am today with that much younger man that first entered the man-made hell is all that I might hope for as I now tell my tale. I can imagine myself sitting in that van so long ago, waiting for those gates to swing open and suck me inside. As I strained to see over the guard's shoulders and out that front window into that great beyond, all I can see was a barren and seemingly lifeless landscape enclosed by first one and then another tall steel fence topped off with rows of ribboned razor wire, and between this gauntlet of impenetrable fences were stacked rows of this same razor wire. The heavy gate slowly slid open, allowing the van to finally enter. Above us was a concrete gun tower, and below us, a pit where a guard would walk beneath the vehicle to be sure nothing or no one was attached to the undercarriage. They called this the Sallyport. The driver got out, and only then could I finally see that to my far right there were blue-clad prisoners walking around a grass field and playing softball or working out on weights. That didn't look too bad. Only later was I informed that those guys were general population prisoners and that inviting rec yard was only for them, not for the death row. FSP was a virtual warehouse of solitary cells where most were intended to first psychologically, and then physically, slowly rot away. Only a small group of FSP were population inmates, and only because they were needed to cook, and clean and whatever else actual work had to be done. I stretched forward as far as I could to get a better look, towards a small concrete area enclosed by yet another tall fence topped off with razor wire. Death row. An even shorter wing sticking out the end of the building next to the death row wing was Q wing. The bottom floor, right through the second window, was home to Old Sparky. A few minutes later the van cleared the security check and we drove into the compound, straight down a narrow ribbon of asphalt toward the far end. As we did so, I made a mental note that the prison lay as straight as a ruler, with 6 almost virtually identical wings, each 3 stories high, extending outward from that backbone somewhat like a centipede lying on its back with its legs stretched straight outward. Only as the van approached the far end did the building structure change as a loading dock area, that I later knew to be the kitchen, break the uniformity. Just beyond that was a circular drive at the base of a long concrete ramp that ascends up into the building itself, which was the only means into or out of this building that I could see. But every prisoner who has ever had the misfortune of doing time at FSP knows this ramp. Although the prison is stacked 3 stories high, it is actually the second floor that is the main floor of the entire prison. For that reason, unlike Dante's Inferno, one does not descend into the depths of this hell, but must actually climb up this mini mountain of a ramp, slowly shuffling along in chains and shackles that make the climb all that much more difficult, and then, and only then, do you enter the prison through a polished tile hallway that leads towards what has always been known as Times Square, where the 4 corners of this world cross within. Slowly I shuffled, and following the directions of my keeper, we moved up this hall towards a wall of steel bars with electric gates to each side. Upon reaching that first set of gates, I arrived at Times Square and stood patiently as we awaited the control room on the far side to open the gate so we could enter. As I would learn, all new inmates arriving at FSP are first placed in a steel holding cage in front of the control room there at Times Square, and so too was I. There I was to wait to be processed in and brought down to the medical infirmary for a cursory checkup before being brought to the wing where I would be housed. Whether it was callous indifference, or the product of malicious intent, inmates first arriving, including myself, would wait in that small cage often for hours, all the while remaining handcuffed behind the back with both waist chains and leg irons, shackled. Even as those hours slowly passed, I knew better than to complain. FSP had a long history of instantaneous hands-on discipline, and not even someone as new and naive as I was then would be stupid enough to provoke the guards. Finally, towards the late afternoon my time came, and I was pulled from the Times Square cage and thrown a bedroll that I was expected to pick up and carry even though I remained handcuffed and chained behind the back. I obediently crouched down and grabbed the bedroll, and then with a guard at each side, I was led to yet another wall of steel bars, awaiting the gate leading into the main hall that runs from one end of the building to the other to open. And then it did, and I again entered, metaphorically descending into another ring of this hell. Conveniently, I would get the full tour, as death row was housed only on the wings at the farthest end of the hall, through a series of more gates, for all practical purposes, an isolated area that was itself a prison within a prison. Stepping through those Times Square gates and into that long hall to my immediate right was a double set of steel doors with a small square window into the prison chapel. I quickly looked through that little window and was surprised to find a cavernous space that actually did look very much like a free world church, complete with polished pews of stained wood divided neatly by a path of red carpet leading up to an altar accented by a wood cross and illuminated by the soft light of what appeared to be candles. Unfortunately, in the 3 decades I have spent on Florida's death row, not even once has a death sentence prisoner ever been allowed to attend a church service. Walking farther, just a short way up the hall, we come to yet another wall of bars with an electronic gate to each side. To my right is the prison gym, enclosed and securely separated by 2 steel doors and another small glass window, deliberately too small for anyone to get through if a riot broke out. As I looked through that window, I could see the vast space within, open all the way from the first floor below us to the ceiling far above, with a full wood-floored basketball court, and what appeared to be a stage where the notorious boxing ring once was, now replaced by sets of steel weights and benches. But again, that gym is off limits to death row. Directly opposite the gym was first what to be an open dining room, one of 2 identical dining rooms, but this one had been converted into the Administrative Confinement Visiting Park, ACVP, which is prison label for the death row visiting area, where if family and friends are willing, they could come each weekend for up to a 6-hour contact visit in a relatively relaxed environment. But few death-sentenced prisoners actually get regular visits, and for the most part, it remained empty. Immediately adjacent to the ACVP was the population dining hall that at that time remained in use. As I would quickly come to know, death row were never allowed to eat in the prison dining hall. Death row was a continuous confinement status, and all meals are served and eaten in the cell. I would learn I was lucky, in a way, not to have access to these areas. This prison has more killings than the rest of Florida's prisons combined, and most of these killings happen in either the dining hall or the gym. As the years passed, I would come to know many condemned prisoners who caught their cases by killing other inmates either in the dining hall or gym, although a few took place on the wings. Again, we waited momentarily for the gate to open and then walked through. Each of the 13 housing wings along this main hall are sealed off by the solid steel doors and locked from both sides. That way, even if something happened on one wing, it is isolated from the other wings. Walking up that hall, the first solid steel door to my left had a large W painted above the door. Back then, W wing was a max psyche wing where prisoners who could not be broken anywhere else were sent there, and once you went in, you either came out broken or dead. It would be years later, after too many died under the pretense of being administered psychiatric care, that the state would close that wing down, and today W wing is not even acknowledged by the FDUC. But for those who did time at FSP up until the 80s, each has many stories of the horrors that took place on W wing. In relatively quick succession, we silently passed the 3 housing wings on the right side known as J, K and L wings, which at that time I first came to Florida State Prison were where the population prisoners were housed 3 tiers high with 17 single-man cells to each side of each floor, all the way up to the roof of the 3rd floor, giving the impression of a large open space surrounded by the cells housing over 100 population prisoners on each of the 3 wings. Unlike the wings housing death row, each of the cells on these wings was built on the outside wall so that within each cell the inmate had his very own window. Too often over the too many years that followed, I wished that I had access to a window so that I could feel the air coming in from outside. To my left, where 3 wings used to house those in closed custody, a common confinement status similar to other states' segregated confinement, where those who committed serious disciplinary infractions would be kept for what could be long periods of time, isolated in single-man cells with very few privileges and under conditions that arguably made even death row seem like a good place to be. See The Harsh Prison Treatment at Stark, Miami Herald, May 26, 1991, by Human Rights Watch Prison Project Director Joanna Weschler. Admin note: Michael refers to this article and we have been unable to locate it online. However, we have found the report. It appears this article is based on Prison Conditions in the United States by Human Rights Watch. The director of this report was Joanna Weschler. Finally, we came to the last of these steel bar walls and its set of electric gates, and the end of that long main hall could now be seen. This time we didn't wait too long and I was quickly guided into this area known as Corridor E, which segregated the last 5 wings. To my right was N and P wing, which were used to house even more closed management inmates when I first arrived to FSP in 1984, but by 1992 the growing number of Florida's death row would be expanded to both of these wings. To my left was S&R Wing, which in 1984 were both exclusively death row. The segregated confinement wings behind the gate in Corridor E are all designed so that the cells are inside the middle of the wing, facing out so that these prisoners cannot have any direct access to a window. Each of the 3 floors has 2 sides, each side with 17 cells of about 6x9, and subtracting the area for the bunk and sink/toilet combo, each cell had an open area of, at best, 24 square feet. And in that small space the condemned would be warehoused for not only years, but decades. The guard motioned me to the nearest wing, labeled with a letter S above the solid steel door. As we waited for the guards within to open the lock on their side, I realized there was another wing beyond these last 4, Q wing. That single steel door at the very end of this hall leads to where prisoners are executed. I couldn't help but look. It appeared to be just another door, not at all unlike the 12 other doors leading into housing areas along the main hall. There appeared to be nothing that indicated what might lie beyond that plain door. But as the years would pass, I would find out that appearances could be quite deceiving. Through that otherwise normal-looking door was where the Florida death house was. When walking through that door, one could be forgiven for thinking it was just another wing. And unless you really knew, it would appear to be just another wing. But through that door, if you take a quick right turn, you'll see a set of stairs that lead down to the first level, just as the stairs do on each of the wings. Only when you actually reach that lower level do you realize that it's not at all like all the other wings.